Welcome to Dr. Ryu's lab, or room 203. This video is going to be an introduction video as well as a tour of our lab and all of the instruments we have. So first up we have the rheometer here, and essentially this instrument will just measure the flow as well as the deformation of your sample. If we go further into the lab over here, we'll find another instrument. This one here is known as the FTIR, which stands for Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy. And this instrument can be used to get a fingerprint spectrum of your sample of interest. We have an ATR attachment here, which has a diamond detector in the middle, which the IR beam is bounced off your sample, so you can have either a solid sample or a liquid sample. And we also have another attachment where you can shine the IR beam directly through your sample, and for that one you would need strictly a liquid sample. Moving over to the right here, we can see that we have this viscometer. Basically, this instrument measures the viscosity of your sample, which is essentially how thick or thin that liquid is. We also have another instrument here known as the DLS, or Dynamic Light Scattering Instrument. And this one works by seeing and detecting particle size as well as polymer size and the distribution of those sizes in solution. Moving over to the far corner of the lab, we have some more instruments over here. We have 3 FDM printers for 3D printing, which is also known as fused deposition modeling 3D printing, and it's a form of additive manufacturing. And these printers work by taking a solid polymer and melting them down and reforming them layer by layer into the 3D printed object of interest. Moving over to the side here, we have these 2 other instruments here. This one is known as the form wash. And essentially, after you have made your 3D print, you will place them in there and it will automatically clean those samples for you automatically. If you want to do it manually, however, we do have these tubs here that you can fill with the washing solution and manually scrub your 3D prints clean. So now that right instrument here is our UV post-curing chamber, which essentially will post-cure any 3D printed material and essentially finish all of the remaining polymerization in that print. So now we're going to move into room 204, which is another part of our lab, and then move into 205, which is here. So this instrument is our Instron, which essentially measures our tensile strength of a 3D printed object. And you can see here that you would just create a basically dog bone shaped sample like this and place it right there into the clamps and stretch until it breaks. So now moving over here, you can see we have these 3 different microscopes, which are known as our POM microscopes, or polarized optical microscopy. And basically these just help us to look at our sample on a more fine scale in real time. So now moving back into room 204, we can see that we have some more 3D printers. And these are known as SLA 3D printers, which stands for sterile lithography. And we have 4 right here in the lab, as well as some additional ones up on some shelves if we need more. But these 3D printers work by taking a liquid polymer resin and curing it layer by layer into a 3D printed object. So it is slightly different from those FDM ones that we looked at before. Also important to mention, we do have another automated washer as well as a UV post-curing chamber in this room, and also a manual washing station. So now moving over to the left here, we can see that we have this UV ozone cleaner, which essentially cleans all of our glass slides and cover slips in this compartment here by irradiating them with UV light. And we can use that for experiments such as our UV transmittance experiments with this UV transmittance apparatus here. This apparatus typically is used to study photopolymerization as well as phase separation and the kinetics of polymerization itself. Moving over to the far end of the lab, we have our spin coater here. And essentially how this works is you would put a substrate in here in the middle and spin it on inside this chamber here with a drop of your sample on it. And by spinning it, it essentially coats the entire sample, the entire substrate. This hood here is particularly for anionic polymerization equipment. This hood generally is for our waste bottles. And then over in this far corner, we have our Abbey refractometer, which essentially just measures the refractive index of any of your samples that you put in there. Moving a bit further, we have our GPC, or our gel permeation chromatography. And essentially, this one works by taking a sample and putting it in a very dilute solution and then evaporating it into a gas and diluting it through a column so that you can essentially have that come off at a certain time and gather information about the size of the particles in that sample. So now lastly, we have the HPLC, or high performance liquid chromatography. And this instrument is basically used as an analytical method to get information about your sample as well as to separate components in a mixture. And this one differs from GPC because it has to be a liquid sample running through the column instead of a gas. So then just one last thing before we end our tour. On this countertop over here, you can see we have our basic scale as well as our micro scale. And that concludes our tour of our lab. We hope you enjoyed listening.